So, yeah. That second homework is due by the end of the day on Wednesday. So if you've got the physical version you want to hang in class, you can on Wednesday. Otherwise, upload to Canvas like last time. If any questions, that is, you're kind of wrapping that up. I'll be in my office today from 2 to 4. I should be in my office Wednesday 2 to 4, and tomorrow I'll be around the building. So if there's a time that you want to meet, shoot me an email. I'm going to set something up that way as well. Other than that, questions before we kind of jump into things. So I will this week's reading I will also get posted after class this afternoon. Between a couple papers, I want to see kind of how far we get today. Probably be something on the hot hand we should maybe allude to a little bit, but something I think is a little bit more interesting. So let's get going here. So we left off last week talking about like the effects of stadiums on cities, right? The economic impact that they can have, about positive, negative externalities, and then some of the things that are around that. So kind of similar, what we'll talk about today are some of the reasons why a city might want to host like a big event, right? So, committing to a team for a long period of time might be a little bit different than if we just want to host one of these really big events that we know generates a lot of revenue. Whether or not that's the Super Bowl, Olympics, World Cup, it doesn't have to just be thinking about the United States, you can think about any country around the world. So why would you want to host one of these? I mean, we looked at like some of the numbers here. Oops, there we go. I mean, what, $720 million. Some studies have shown maybe the economic impact of the I think this was the Super Bowl, if I remember correctly. I think I have it in the next bullet point. But I don't even know the numbers that the Olympics generate, and it's really hard to measure, right? But it's astronomical, right? So yeah, the costs are really high as well. Like what was the 20 in Beijing Summer Olympics? Like they spent a crazy amount of money on the infrastructure to host those games. So if the costs are that high, they must also believe that the revenues are even higher, right? Otherwise, I guess maybe, if they do experience a negative profit there, maybe that's like the how much they value, pride in their country or something like that, right? But you would assume that they're choosing to do this because it generates a profit, right? The revenues will kind of outweigh those astronomical costs as well. So another study found that the average impact instead of the Super Bowl, so those are the Super Bowl numbers, was only about 30 million. Right? So how are some of these studies so far off? I mean, it's a huge range to think that 720 versus $30 million is generated by hosting the Super Bowl, right? Well, what they why might they disagree, right? Well, if we're just looking at the revenue generated during Super Bowl week or Super Bowl weekend, maybe that is as high as 720 million. But really, what are we interested in? We're not interested in just the level of revenue. We want to know what's the additional revenue, right? We're interested in what's the marginal revenue brought to the city by hosting this event, right? So if I just looked at how much revenue we racked up over the Super Bowl week or Super Bowl weekend, that's not going to account for the fact that even if the Super Bowl wasn't there, what's probably true about revenue that's generated in a city big enough to host a Super Bowl? Probably a lot of revenue is generated even if the event isn't there, right? And if that event wasn't there, I don't know, maybe they host Comic-Con or some other thing that generates a lot of revenue. So it's the same, it goes back to this idea of we want to know the additional revenue. It's like, what are we giving up? What's the opportunity cost of hosting the Super Bowl? We're not hosting something else, right? And even if we didn't host something else, we're still going to have a pretty large size revenue generated in the city, even without bringing an event in that weekend. So this is kind of the main difference. If you're looking at these numbers, you're thinking about revenue generated in the city versus additional revenue generated from having the event. Right? So we're starting to think about we want to always be looking at that marginal revenue. Okay. There's something else I wanted to say. Now I forget what it was. So this study by Matson and Bade, or I don't know how to pronounce his last name, to be honest with you, but I'm assuming they'll say Bade. If I'm trying to do this, what I might want to do is something like this, right? If I could break down, I could have some data where I'm looking at how much revenue is generated. Let's assume I can get the numbers for cities, how much revenue is generated on that week, right? So I could break this down into every city. I'd have 52 observations over a year, right? So maybe I look at, okay, how much revenue is generated, and I could kind of include things like, well, what's the population of the city? That, the revenue generated in a city probably is directly related to how, what the population is. Maybe the second thing I want to include is something like, well, what's the per capita income in the city, right? And I'd want to start including all these additional control variables that help me predict how much revenue is generated, right? Then, so a bunch of different control variables that try to help predict what revenue is going to be. Then I have, well, I'll call this B3 actually, something which is, I don't know, we'll call this one the Super Bowl, which is just a one if in that week the Super Bowl is hosted in that city, 0 if not. So essentially what this is accounting for is like, remember, this would be the effect, B3 would be the additional increase or decrease in revenue from hosting the Super Bowl, right? Going 1 unit increase, 0 to the one group. Holding everything else constant. So if I've got things like population, income, demographic information, age demographic information, like I could get a pretty accurate, holding all those things constant. It's like two cities that otherwise look almost identical, but one of them hosts the Super Bowl. What's the additional revenue, right? What they're kind of doing when they're just looking at revenue is saying, don't hold any of these factors constant. If I host the Super Bowl, what is revenue that weekend? Well, I'm not accounting for all these other factors that are probably going to generate higher revenue as well, and are probably correlated with the fact that that city is more likely to be able to host the Super Bowl if these other things like the population is higher, average income is higher, et cetera, et cetera. So, basically the more appropriate way, the way the economists estimate it, is using a regression like this, right? Now, what's even more interesting you could do, I think this is a different, they did multiple studies, and one they kind of like this. This is just kind of comparing every week throughout the year to be the same, right? I mean, and maybe the revenue generated in Indianapolis varies wildly from February to July, right? So a really good comparison would be, okay, what if I looked at the same city during the same week, but 1 year they host a Super Bowl, the next year they don't? Well, then instead of just 1 year of data with 52 weeks, I might want to get like the last 10 years, right? And then I could do something like not only control for population, income, all these other things, maybe then I start to control for, well, what week number was it? Was this the first week of the year, the second week, the third week, the fourth? And that way it kind of controls for when I host the Super Bowl, what would have been the expected or predicted revenue increase from just being in that week, right? And this would be like a bunch. I say week number here. I wouldn't want to just include one variable. It would be like week number 1 plus week number 2, right? And include an indicator for every single week throughout that year. Now the interpretation is holding constant the information about the city, but also holding constant what week of the year it is. Now what's the additional impact of that increase in revenue? I could even take it one step further, which is not just control for the week, right? But maybe there's something inherently different about cities that I'm not capturing using population, income, and all these other control variables. So I think I've mentioned this before in some other examples. What's something else I could do here to control for the fact that each city might have its own unique kind of revenue generation? So if I wanted to control for that, each week might have its different revenue generation. I included a bunch of these indicator variables. I could do the exact same thing for including indicator variables for every single city. So, I don't know. Right, and these are just 1, 0. 1 if the observation of my data is from Indianapolis, 0 if not. Well, now if I include these week indicators and these team, what we usually call fixed effects, right? That's going to capture anything that's different about that city specifically. And then this is going to capture anything that's different about that week specifically. So now the interpretation of my Super Bowl variable is holding constant what week I'm looking at in the year, holding constant what city I'm looking at, holding constant all these other demographic, population, income. If the city in one of those years doesn't host a Super Bowl, relative to when it does, then what's the expected increase in revenue? So if we start to include all these additional controls, we can get wildly different estimates than when we leave them out, right? Because then if we don't include for what week we're looking at or what city we're looking at, I mean, we could just be capturing the fact that the teams that are more, the cities that are more likely to host a Super Bowl are also more likely to just generate revenue during that week of the year, or more likely to generate more revenue because it's that specific city. So that's essentially what where those estimates would come from. And when you do it that way, you don't get these astronomically high values. You get something still pretty high. I mean, still bringing in an additional $30 million to the city, which is why you still see cities like Indianapolis want to host the Super Bowl. But yeah, this is kind of an interesting, we're starting to think about, we don't just want to look at total values most often, we want to try to get this idea of margin. And using regression analysis, that's going to give us more of an informative idea of what's the additional revenue generated from hosting the Super Bowl or not. Any questions on that idea before we keep moving? Okay. And I forget some of these, you know, thinking about not just the Super Bowl, but like the Olympics. One thing that's kind of interesting, you know, you've got a bunch of revenue that's generated, like merchandise, hotel taxes, restaurant taxes kind of go up around the time when these countries, the specific cities that host the Olympics. But in a very similar regression model that I just showed you for the Super Bowl, the same authors, the same researchers did a similar thing, but did that for whether or not the city hosted the Olympics, right? And what they found was there's no long run impact. So in like the year that you host the Olympic, there is a slight increase in revenues, I believe decrease in unemployment, increase in per capita income. So that is having these positive economic effects. But essentially, once the Olympics are gone, well, what happens? A lot of those jobs go away. There's not additional tourism still. So, you know, there's see a decrease in the average income for a lot of these workers in the area. And there's really no significant long run impact. In fact, some of the estimates for certain cities finds they overpay, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But even though they have these additional increase in revenues and these, you know, positive economic indicators during the time of hosting the Olympics, when you look at the total cost, they actually aren't profitable. It's not profitable to host the Olympics. So how can you help reduce costs, right? So one thing that has been proposed, if you think about think about somewhere like, what's a good example? I don't know, let's say Indianapolis wanted to host the Summer Olympics, right? What are they gonna have to do? Yeah.
Fix the infrastructure.
They need to comply. I mean, they probably can't even do it within. They probably have to go a little bit further outside of it and like spend a lot of money on building all the facilities just so they can handle all of the people, all of the events, right? You know, I don't think Lucas Oil and, you know, Baker's Light is going to cover it, right? So it's these huge costs, right? However, what if right now Salt Lake City was like, hey, we want to host another Olympics? What's true about what they probably have to do? Yeah, I gotta update some of what they used back in '96, I think. But they still have the infrastructure there. So one of the things that's been proposed is trying to limit the number of cities that can host the Olympics, because then you really don't have to pay these huge infrastructure costs every single time. You obviously might have to do some updates, things like that, but you can reduce the cost dramatically for subsequent years, right? Now, I think the IOC probably doesn't do this because, well, I actually don't know why, because if you think about it, if I could greatly reduce my costs, the net benefit, so go back to my example of Indianapolis. Well, actually, let's just put some numbers to it and just to think about this. So let's say, I don't know, these numbers probably won't make sense, but we're just going to have some. So $100 million would be Indianapolis's infrastructure costs. And maybe they believe that they're going to generate an additional $200 million of revenue, right? So how much, if they were making a bid for the Olympics,
what would they be willing to pay up to host the Olympics? They'd be indifferent if they had to put a bid in of. It's my stomach, geez. So if I benefit $200 million, my cost to hosting the event were $100 million. What's my net benefit? So as long as I put in a bid that is $100 million or less, I'm still going to be better off, right? I'm still going to generate, and sorry, I should say this is like the additional revenue generated, right? That's the additional revenue and the additional costs, okay? So they'd pay up to 100 million. Well, what if we have this idea of a rotation, right? Where then the next time, right, they want to host this event, they don't have to spend near as much. Maybe they only have to spend $10 million the second time they host that event. They still generate the same amount of additional revenue from having the Olympics there. Guess I shouldn't draw an arrow over there. Well, how much would they be willing to pay up to host it for the second time? Yeah, the difference between their additional benefits or their additional revenues and their additional costs, right? So I don't, it's a little wild to me that the IOC, I think it has been proposed, they aren't currently doing it, to kind of go on this rotation system, because that, at least if you limit it to like these 10 cities, when they put in bids are going to be a lot higher, right? They're going to be willing to pay a lot more. Instead, by kind of doing a new city all the time, you're keeping those costs high. These infrastructure costs are just remaining high every single time, meaning that these cities are willing to put in kind of lower bids. Now, this hasn't really played out, but along this logic, if there's no stipulations on who can host the Olympics, what cities would you expect? So like, doesn't matter if you've hosted an event before, doesn't matter if you never have. Along these lines, if we didn't put any stipulations on it, what would you expect to have happen? Who would make the highest bids to host the Olympics? Most profitable cities, which is going to mean if we had like a completely free market, the cities who have already put money into the infrastructure are going to be the ones that are more likely to put in a higher bid, meaning they're going to be more likely to be the cities that, win out, right? Have the highest bid and able to host it again. Well, there are stipulations on there. I forget all of them, but like they won't have the, if you've hosted the Olympics, you can't even put a bid in the next, I forget how many. And so kind of hard to see this play out in a more modern area, but it's also like things change over time, right? And so these infrastructure costs, I'm using Indianapolis as an example, maybe there's some cities that really don't have that high of infrastructure costs, right? I don't know, somewhere like, I don't know, LA or something where they've got like a bunch of different sporting arenas, and then maybe there's an area where it really wouldn't cost them near as much to kind of improve their infrastructure to host the Olympics as it would Indianapolis, right? So whoever kind of has those lower infrastructure costs, more likely to be the ones that win because they're more willing to pay, or they're more willing to put a higher bid in. Any questions on that idea? Kind of reuse this here in a second too. Okay. Back here. Oops. So there's this benefit. It's also not even just infrastructure, but right, there's something called learning effects. Is once I host an event once, I'm more likely to be able to do it better the second time. So I can probably generate, my example, I said they generated the same revenues. You'll probably generate even higher additional revenues the next time because they're going to be able to know how to make things work more smoothly. You might have identified some areas where you can sell some additional types of merchandise or items. You also probably learn what was costly and how you can reduce costs. So there'll be like this definite kind of benefit of hosting the event multiple times. I'm going to skip ahead to this and then come back to the other two slides. So because this is kind of related to what we were just talking about. So when these cities put these bids in for whatever event they'd want to be hosting, I think mainly thinking about the Olympics or the Super Bowl, but this could be anything. Like I said, this could be Comic-Con. I don't exactly know how Comic-Con chooses where they go, but right, if cities are putting bids in, I assume that they are, right? They're trying to make the most money, and whatever city finds that event to be the most attractive to them, providing the highest additional benefit or the highest additional revenue, that's gonna be the city that would put in the highest bid, right? So whatever city values this event the most, they'll put in the highest bid. Problem is, we kind of call this the winner's curse, which is if I'm incorrect about how much additional revenue I am gonna make, who's gonna win the bid is whoever had the most, the highest expectation in terms of the additional revenue generated. But if they're wrong and it's way lower, well, they just put in the highest bid, but they didn't get that much additional revenue back. So we kind of go through a quick little idea to think about how this could play out. So let's say we've got 3 different cities or whatever wanting to host this event. And so let's say one of them benefits 10 million, 1 15, and 1 20 million. So we'll call this city A, B, and C, right? So this is the additional revenue that each city would earn, right? Like this is, you know, we can't, this is using this as an example, like let's assume that we know exactly how much they would earn after the fact. Like they hosted the event, this is how much they generated. The problem is, going into it, they have expectations, right? So if their expectations were correct and they all guessed or all estimated perfectly what the additional revenue generated would be, what city is going to win the bid? If they benefit 10 million, 15, 20, who's going to be willing to pay the most for this? Team C or City C, right? So whoever has the highest benefit, marginal benefit, highest marginal revenue, right, is going to be the one that puts in the highest bid and wins the right to host that event. Problem is, if they're not correct, if they can't estimate these actual revenues correctly, and let's say we've got, I don't know, city A thinks they'll get 20 million, city B thinks 15, and city C is pessimistic, right? Well, now who's going to win? City A. The only problem is they'd put a bid in up to 20 million. In fact, let's assume, just like best case scenario, they all know the bids of every other city. And so if I'm city A, what's the amount of money that I bid to host this event? Just, you know, as slightly above 15 million as I can, right? So best case scenario, I don't know, 15 million and $1, right? Just barely beat out that other city. The only problem is I overpaid. My actual marginal revenue generated was only 10 million. I spent $15 million or 15 million and $1. So I'm actually going to be losing money, right? So it's kind of a problem when we have these bid systems, because it's not that whoever will benefit the most wins the bid. It's whoever believes they're going to benefit the most wins the bid. The problem is, if I'm overly optimistic, that leaves a potential for me to actually lose money hosting this event, which is, I think, you know, a lot of the argument that most of the researchers that did the Super Bowl and the Olympic stuff, especially for the Olympics, this is kind of the justification for why we do see cities lose a lot of money hosting the Olympics, is because the ones who win the bids have the highest expectations, but expectations don't always match up with reality, right? So that is what is generally referred to as that winner's curse. Oops. Sorry, there we go. So, anything else I want to say here? And it could work in an opposite direction. So I did an example where I thought about like what their expected marginal revenue was. You could also do the same kind of thing. Whoever expects to have the lowest costs, right? They may also win the bid, but then costs actually end up being higher, meaning that they lose money from hosting the event. So it can work in either expectation, either overly optimistic about your additional revenues or overly optimistic about how low your additional costs will be, right? And they would both work in very, very similar ways. Okay. Any questions on that? Okay. So I'm gonna go back to this. So I think saw one of the examples I've seen using this model. It could be used for thinking about hosting the Olympics and like what events you would want to host. So I'll run with that example, and then I'll give you a couple more after we work through it. But think about it as like when I'm bidding to host the Olympics, let's say Summer Olympics. I think it's a little bit easier to envision this. What events, if I could choose only like to host one event, or which one would I probably choose first? Can't think of the specific like sport or whatever. Think about it in economic terms. Which event would I want to host first? The one that generates the highest additional revenue. So if I'm choosing sports, I'm probably for the Summer Olympics thinking about maybe basketball, track and field. I have to look at the list after that. I don't know off my memory, but right, you can think of there's some sports that are going to generate a lot more additional revenue than what's the goofy one where they like. It's not a decathlon. No, it's not a decathlon, but there are parts like they shoot, right? Like actually the one I'm thinking of the Winter Olympics, I think they like shoot something like whatever. These things that don't generate a lot of additional revenue, right? So I might not want to host all the events. The problem is if I make a bid for this, right, I have to host all the events. So how can these how can the IOC or whatever kind of get away with making sure that cities host all the events? So it's kind of this idea of maybe oh wait, that's what I wanted, all or nothing. Let me see, what did I have here? I think I went the wrong direction. Oh, I'm going down, not up. Sorry. Okay, I'm skipping ahead here. So this is what I was introduced. So this idea of all or nothing, right? I can host all the events, or I can't host any, right? I have to host all of them if I want to host the Olympics. So the way that we see these models work is something like this. So we're going to assume that, actually, I should probably use some black and then use colors for the other thing. We're going to have some quantity, and this could be the number of events in my example, kind of for the Olympics. We can think about this as like the price paid to host these events, like per event. So we might have this demand curve, and we're going to assume, right, it's the Olympics, so they kind of have monopoly power, right? There's only one supply of the Olympic Games, right? And then we can also, just for simplicity, and we could make this a little more complicated if we wanted to, have an increasing marginal cost. We'll just assume for a second there's kind of this constant marginal cost to kind of hosting each one of these events. Like I said, we make it more complicated and have an increasing marginal cost, but the same sort of principles that I'm going to show you would apply. I just make it a little more complicated. So if this was a single price monopolist, like I'm the Olympic Committee and I'm selling off individual events, I'd want to sell them. Here would be kind of my optimal quantity. And here would be the price I would charge for each event. Now it's kind of goofy because like we know they don't do that in practice, but like this is the thought experiment, right? If they could do this, there would be an optimal quantity and price to set, which means some of the events no one would pay for, right? If I set the price for all these events, yes, someone's for sure, we think about demand representing marginal benefit. Marginal benefit to hosting is marginal revenue. This is like basketball, track and field. We go down the list. Once we get down here, these are going to be events that if under a single price monopolist model, if the IOC sold events off one at a time, we're no longer going to see, I don't know, baton twirling or something, right? Like, I don't know, something that people don't generally watch, right? So this is a problem. They want all these events to be hosted. So if we think about what's happening here, under the single price monopolist, how much would the consumers benefit? Now, the consumers here is the city who wins the events, right? Or who's hosting the events. So consumer surplus, right? I guess here I'll just read a little bit easier, is going to be the area underneath my demand curve, but above the price I'm paying. Right? And just to make a point, producer surplus would be the area underneath the price I'm paying, or sorry, price I'm receiving, but above whatever my marginal cost is, right? Kind of remember, surplus represents like the net benefit to both parties. The difference is for producers, price is a good thing, right? And for consumers, price is a bad thing. So we kind of start out with this initial consumer and producer surplus, okay? Well, if I look at this and say, okay, I know that I want, as the IOC, I want the quantity, what can I call this? We'll say this is like the desired number of events they want hosted, right? They want all of them hosted. So whatever all of them ends up being, right? This is what it would be. So how can I convince whoever is purchasing these events, if I'm selling it off as a single package, what price could what total amount could I charge them, right? Or what kind of, maybe another way to think about this. Up to what point would I know that whatever city this is still be willing to host all events? We're going to assume that the city wants positive profits, right? And they'd be indifferent at the point that they're zero. So let's say instead I go, okay, look, I'm going to keep the price of these events the same. But if you want these high revenue generating sports, this is an all or nothing proposal. You have to buy all of the events at this price. Well, it still could be the case that consumers choose to do this. So if we think about why, this area here would represent the loss to consumers, right? Because past this event, the marginal benefit of hosting these events is way below the price I have to pay for them. So this is going to represent kind of the loss to consumers. So if they're losing out, why might they still choose to buy all of these events at this price? What would have to be true?
You're making more off them than you pay for them.
Yeah, it would have to be that my consumer surplus before, right? Kind of if I were to be able to buy these events one at a time, has to be greater than whatever this consumer loss is that I, have to take on if I want to host all the events. And so it must be the case that if they're putting in these high bids to host all these events, they believe that the consumer surplus they'll generate kind of outweighs whatever that consumer loss is for those events that aren't as profitable, right? But this is how we still see, baton twirling in the Olympics, right? You have to, it's all or nothing, right? As long as that original consumer surplus is greater than the loss from hosting these additional kind of non-profitable events, we'll still see the city kind of put this high bid and be willing to pay whatever price this is. Okay. Any questions on that idea? Is that? So I'm going to point something else out. We'll complicate this a little bit. But I think it's worth kind of mentioning. So notice here was producer surplus before. If I'm able to get away with this, what could I actually charge this team, or what would be kind of the optimal price to set on this package of events? Well, whatever that single price monopolist price is, times whatever that desired quantity, right? And my producer surplus now is this entire area, right? The area under the price that I'm receiving for each event, but above my marginal cost. So in these all or nothing models, whoever's selling the events benefits from an all or nothing kind of proposal. Who doesn't benefit? Whoever's purchasing it, right? That consumer. And I know there's a couple other examples, so you don't have to just think about this like events hosted in the Olympics. I feel like there was, you could kind of model this for even teams that want to relocate, cities that want to relocate a team to their area. Because you could think about like maybe given the positive and negative externalities that exist and the fact that like there's going to be a declining marginal revenue for each additional game you host, maybe I only want an NFL team for 6 games, right? Maybe that I only want to pay whatever price it is, and the price there is kind of indirect. It would be how much money maybe I'm offering them for their stadium, right? How much I'm going to subsidize their stadium costs. But maybe it's only optimal for me to have 6 NFL games. Well, Problem is, I have to, once I have the team, I have to host all of them. So 8 or I guess 9 now because they got the 17 games, so some 8 or 9. So how do can I make sure that city wants to host all of them? Like I do an all or nothing, right? I mean, you host my team. If my team relocates to your city, you have to host all the games. Even if some of the negative externalities that exist, and the fact that each additional game is having a less and less value to the city, some of those games might not be profitable, but on the whole, yeah, maybe I lose on those last 2 or 3 games, but the first 6, I generated way more consumer surplus or way more additional revenue that overcompensates for that. So you could think about this even as a model that you could predict that you would see a city whose optimal point would not be to host every game that team plays, still be willing to put in a proposal and pay that price per game, that single price monopolist price per game, as long as that loss of the games that they don't want to host isn't greater than the consumer surplus generated from those games they do. Does that make sense what I'm saying there? Another example we see sometimes is like, oh, they use this because I guess it was I guess that MLB did a really good job of trying to estimate what that consumer loss and consumer surplus would be to these different cities when they were trying to figure out where they wanted to put is it Canton? Or no, sorry. Canton's the football hall of fame, right? I think that's the one where like it's not profitable to I forget what it was, something about putting in statues or some type of thing for every single player, right? Like it would only be optimal to put like the best, right? Like, I mean, some of the players that no one's ever heard of in the football hall of fame, I don't want to create like their own specific thing or plaque or whatever. But if I want to have the football hall of fame, I have to have a plaque for everyone that's in it. And so it was kind of a similar idea where, yeah, if they could buy individual plaques, I'm going to want to get, I don't know, Jim Brown, Unitas, whatever, the kind of best players that I believe will draw in the most people, but I have to have a plaque for everyone. And so you can kind of model that in a similar way, right? If I want to have this Hall of Fame, I got to have a plaque for everyone. So it's the same kind of a thing. It's just our quantity instead of events becomes plaques or whatever it is. Do you have a question? No. Questions on this? All right. So and this is kind of what I was getting at here. But one other issue we can think about once a team does relocate, is once I get a team in a city and they're locked there, it's a similar idea to the Olympics where I know. So let's try to put some numbers to it to make sense. Let's say that I have a team in Indianapolis right now with the Colts, right? Actually, yeah, we'll do that. So let's say, I don't know, currently they're generating $100 million of additional revenue by being in Indianapolis, right? And their cost of building a new stadium are what? I mean, they have a stadium already, so we can kind of almost think about it as, I don't have to build a new stadium, right? And my additional costs are 0. If I want to relocate, let's say they want to move to, I don't know, probably doesn't make a lot of sense, but just choosing another city, right? Let's say they want to relocate to Louisville, right? And they actually know that if they move to Louisville, for whatever reason, they can generate more additional revenue, right? Problem is, they have to build a new stadium. And like I said, these numbers don't even make, these are going to be astronomically low compared to what the reality is, but I'm just some numbers to have. Let's say the cost of building the stadium there, a new stadium is $100 million. Well, because of this, their net benefit of each location, Indy is going to be significantly higher. So once you have a team, once you've got a team in your city, you know that you kind of have some power, right? Because the next best alternative, unless they can find somewhere that already has a stadium, right? They're going to have huge costs in moving away. So if I'm the city, and let's say I want to increase, well, it doesn't make as much sense to increase taxes on the team. Let's say instead that I had promised a bunch of subsidies, to support the building of the stadium, but then, oh no, our government, Indianapolis mismanaged their funds. We don't have enough money to kind of give you what we committed, right? We said we would give you whatever, pay for half the stadium. We no longer have those funds. So how much could I reduce the amount of money that I'm giving them and still ensure that they're not going to leave Indianapolis here? Yeah, basically, I know that even if I say, okay, look, I promised you whatever, how many, I'm going to give you $79 million less, right? So it's essentially like I've now just increased your cost to building your stadium, right? It's kind of weird because it's like the costs were already there. They just switched now from the city promising to pay it. Now the team has to. So they would still have a net benefit of 21 million. If the next best alternative of Louisville still only gives me 20, I know that they're still going to be like, well, okay, we won't pull out. So once you get those teams in there, like unless, I'm sure there are some legal things drawn up ahead of time, but if you had a financial enough crisis in the city, they really could pull back some of that funding and they know that the team's still going to stay there, right? Yeah, I don't know. So it's interesting to think about, like, once you get a team, like the city really has the upper hand, right? Because the cost to moving is just so high compared to the cost of remaining in the same city. And I'm kind of assuming even if you had higher additional revenues available in other cities. So when you start to think about team locations, and we talked about a little bit before, but I've heard things like, you might think there's a city where it's like growing really quick and it's kind of surprising that it doesn't have a sports team. Well, what has to be true is how high would the additional revenues in Louisville have to be here for them to leave Indianapolis? And let's assume that they gave them all, like before I was saying that they were pulling back money. Let's assume they're not pulling back any of the money they're going to give them. So it's staying in Indianapolis, my costs are still zero. How high would revenues have to be in Louisville, additional revenues, for me to then choose to switch over? Yeah, $200 million, right? So you can start to think about these, once I get a city, or once I get a team in my city, it's really, I have a lot of power and kind of, it's really unlikely that we're going to see teams leave those locations, unless there's a market that does provide a really high amount of additional revenue, maybe like LA, right? Which is why maybe we saw some kind of teams leave it for there. Or I would probably argue, another one, this kind of combines a lot of stuff we've talked about, but it's the relevant example in the NFL. So the Oakland Raiders, right, moved to Las Vegas. I don't think that there's probably many people who would argue that they haven't seen a decrease in demand because they pissed off a lot of their fan base, right? So they knew moving was going to cost them some additional revenue, right? But what had to be true, right? Even the fact that they had to build this new stadium in Las Vegas that made it more attractive for them to move. Well, they must believe that they can generate a lot of additional revenue by being in Vegas relative to Oakland. I guess only time will tell if their estimates on that are accurate. But that, in terms of the economic principles behind why they decided, it would have to be they believe that the marginal revenues are significantly higher because they have this high cost of building the stadium by moving, whereas it was zero before. Any questions before we keep moving here? All right, so we do a little kind of things today are a little bit more abstract. Talked about the winner's curse. Talked about this a little bit, but when you put a bid in for a team, a lot of the time it's not like a city says we're going to give you $5 million. They say we kind of have this proposed bond that will raise enough money to kind of subsidize part of your stadium, right? And we promise that we'll kind of generate, or we'll kind of issue enough bonds where we can generate enough money to pay for half your stadium or 100% of your stadium in some cases, right? So what will the kind of total cost of the city be? We can think about it. We're going to get some money, or some explicit money from taxes. We're also, the infrastructure, we're going to have to kind of spend some money on that. But also, like, what was the value of what we had to give up? Like, what was the value of the land, right? So it's not just how much money the team is going to, or the city's going to have to pay. It's what are they giving up as well, right? Those opportunity costs. What I want to get to more of so I had these links. And then one of them pulled the infographic, and I will try to bring it in next class because I couldn't find, I found it on Reddit somewhere. Like they disappeared, but it's still out there on Reddit. So I have to re-find it and bring in the new link. But these are, the second link at least kind of has a breakdown of recent stadiums and how much or what percent of them was paid or subsidized by the city. Like, did the city pay for 50% of the stadium costs? This one was just really cool. I hope I can find it on Reddit again because it had like, it was this visual where it would pop up the stadium, and then if it was red, it meant 0. If it was blue, it meant they paid for 100, and then kind of shades of purple in between. But you can kind of get an idea. We look at this and you look across different leagues. You know, some cities paying for subsidizing the stadiums by 100%, right? Some of them, like what, New York, 0% public money. So what do you think, and kind of look at this here a little more in detail. What do you think is probably generally true about the cities that offer a higher percent or offer to cover a higher percent of the cost of the stadium? Why might they be doing that? Smaller markets. Probably smaller markets, right? They know they're going to have to overcompensate for the fact that they might not be able to promise as much additional revenues for these teams. So what can they do? Cut costs, right? And so if we kind of look at this, I don't know, Boston, 10%, New York 0. I think this is old, so it doesn't have LA. But then if you start to look at some of our smaller markets, Jacksonville, St. Louis, so it's older data. Some of the smaller markets we see a lot higher percent kind of paper, and that's not always the case. Like I think Chicago paid for a pretty high percent, 75%, right? So they're kind of up there. And you can look across the different leagues. I just put these in the slides. We're not going to go through them with a fine-tooth comb. But there's quite a bit of variation. You'll notice, look at these numbers. So we've got what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cities that are paying for 100% in Major League Baseball. And looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I mean, pretty much 8 here with 97%. So there's a few more teams in the NFL or cities in the NFL who are offering to pay for the entire stadium, which probably means that they believe what is true about an NFL team relative to a Major League Baseball team. Having an NFL team in the city generates a significantly higher amount of additional revenue than the Major League Baseball, right? That's because they're willing to pay for more of the stadium. I put the MLS one in as well. It's just kind of interesting. You got a sport that doesn't generate a lot of revenue. What happens to subsidies offered by the cities? You get a lot more zeros in there, right? You don't get as many 100%. And then I think I had the NBA was the last one. Once again, we kind of see like some of these larger markets, Philly, Boston, some more history programs. They're not going to, they know the teams aren't leaving, right? They don't have to give them any money to build a new stadium. Whereas some of the smaller markets, Oklahoma City, Charlotte, Memphis, in order to get a team to relocate to their city, they had to pay for 100% of that new stadium. So we'll talk on Wednesday a little bit more about how they generate all this money to support these teams. Before you leave, since you're all here, pretty good discussion today. Just want to get you recorded, get a ton of time for showing up. Like I said, if you have questions over that homework, I'll be in my office 2 to 4 today. Schedule something for tomorrow or 2 to 4 on Wednesday. Okay. All right. We'll see you guys on Wednesday.